Trying to explain the importance of certain places in Africa, especially islands, is a very difficult task. The difficulty, of course, being the fact that there are some people who have been elevated above others, even within the context of Africa, for propaganda purposes. For one, the Zulus, who, even though they were a great nation and a great empire, they did not exactly do what had happened in Mozambique. The people of Mozambique were a much greater and a much more extensive civilization. They held their own until the 1900s, and this is a well known fact within historians. This is not to downplay the history of several tribes. Of course, the Zulus had things that were more impressive that they did than build an empire, which is maintain the empire and have linguistic elements about themselves, and of course, fusing with cultures that were around them that would make them become more formidable to the point that they could defeat the Portuguese. Now, people don't talk about the fact that the Portuguese, the Europeans, the English, the British, the whoever, they all got defeated by African tribes over and over again. They highlight one situation in order, again, to distract from the many defeats. Now, something that I want to stress is that the islands were usually the things that were taken over by the Portuguese. And as you can see from Wikipedia, these islands went through several names during their takeover. But again, by the way, if you want to know which page this is Portuguese Mozambique. And it talks about the colonization of the Mozambican island. And then, of course, the attempts to capture the full land of Mozambique, which did not happen until the 1800s. But the point is, regardless of the fact that they had guns, regardless of the fact that they had other weapons like cannon fire and things like that, it would help only a little. And of course, I've talked about the giant war that took place, which was aided by the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire to help the people in this area fight off these people. So let's quickly read Wikipedia. Until the 20th century, the land and peoples of Mozambique were barely affected by the Europeans who came to its shores and entered its major rivers. As the Muslim traders, mostly Swahili, were displaced from the coastal centers and routes to the interior by the Portuguese, migrations of Bantu peoples continued and tribal federations formed and reformed as the relative power of local chiefs changed. For 4 centuries, the Portuguese presence was meager. Coastal and river trading posts were built, abandoned, and built again. Governors sought personal profits to take back to Portugal, and colonialists were not attracted to the distant area with its relatively unattractive climate. Those who stayed were traders who married local women and successfully maintained relationships with local chiefs. In Portugal, however, Mozambique was considered to be a vital part of the world empire. Periodic recognition of the relative insignificance of the revenues it could produce was tempered by the mystique which developed regarding missions of the Portuguese to bring their civilization to the Africa territory. It was believed that through missionary activity and other direct contact between Africans and Europeans, the Africans could be taught to appreciate and participate in Portuguese culture. In the last decade of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, integration of Mozambique into the structure of the Portuguese nation was begun. After all of that area of the present province had been recognized by other European powers as belonging to Portugal, administrators waged wars against African polities to assert control over the territory. Civil administration was established throughout the area. The building of an infrastructure was begun, and agreements regarding the transit trade of Mozambique's landlocked neighbors to the west, such as southern Rhodesia, northern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, were made. Now, at all times in history, you always hear the same few basically propaganda statements. They ran into savages, they had superior weapons, they were better at trading, they were more interested in science, and they had the religion on their side. None of this seems to have made any real impact, not on Mozambique. It was blind. The Portuguese could not take over. It became more and more and more difficult as the years went on. And realizing that these people were not just stuck to this land. I mean, remember there was that letter, even far north, but there was a letter from a Swahili woman who was sending a letter to the Portuguese in India, and she was making demands. You know why? Because they were operating as equals. This is one of the reasons why Africans didn't just kick out the Portuguese, even though they had bad intentions, because, of course, some of these bad intentions could easily be repelled. But what of new military tactics taught to the Africans by the Portuguese? What about these new military tactics that they implemented that now they could continue slave raids and all this other thing in the style of the Portuguese? Again, another myth. It is only late in its history that the people of this island started having a devalued sense of human life to the point where slavery became common. Think about this, right? We all talk about the Berlin Conference. First, let me quickly explain what the Berlin Conference is for those who don't know. The Berlin Conference was a meeting in which multiple European states decided that they were going to carve Africa. Now, I want you to think about this in your head. I want you to think about this deeply in your head. It took the entire continent of Europe coming together to colonize some of the smallest kingdoms in Africa that they discovered 700 years ago. When they found these kingdoms, the way they wrote about them was not they are these small little tribes. For example, Antonio Francisco Cardiem, who made this beautiful drawing of Japan and was servicing in Japan until later in his life when he had to go to Goa and China. He basically, his ship got shipwrecked in Mozambique. What he wrote is slightly fascinating. He did not write of a defeated people, he did not write of a captured people, and this is from the 1600s. Instead, he gives us insight. And again, these people weren't exactly the fondest of Negroes, but he gives us insight on how the Portuguese were struggling with the Africans, calling meetings with these Africans and moving Africans from island to island. For example, moving some people from Mozambique to Madagascar, some people from Madagascar to the Comoros, in order to try and use political maneuvers to try and take over some of their leadership. This almost reads like later years, almost like the 1900s, the strategy. But again, they got guns, right? The Europeans, they came with guns, giant ships. They had all this science that the rest of the world did not have. So, what was the struggle? Now, I was going to make a video about Monomatapa once again, but since I've already made the video, I might as well just re-upload the previous one that I made because I think it's actually one of the most accurate ones that I've ever made. This Monomatapa kingdom, you must remember, was in charge of several places, including islands, and its size, though still debated to this day, seems to have started from the Cape of Good Hope all the way to the island of Mozambique. If this was truly its influence, we are not talking about a civilization that is comparable to Japan. We're talking about a civilization that is better than Japan and able to control a much larger area and also to build civilization with no friction, even though there should have been tons of it from both the Muslims and the Portuguese who came from Arabia and beyond. Even though the people of Europe, especially the English, had bad intentions for the people, the Africans, they sometimes gave credit where credit was deserved. But of course, they did not always act as a fair judge. In this section where it is written, they give credit to some of the Africans, and in the sentence previously, before this whole passage comes up, they give credit to Africans, but then they go back and attack the people. These are later writings that are taken more seriously than some of the earlier ones, even though we know today that most of it is propaganda. In fact, I've talked about Zarura a lot, and even he is taken as propaganda in the early days. Zarura downplays the use of Negroes within the exploration of the African coast. But even there, he can't conceal or he can't pretend that the people in that area were not skilled.